Olá, sejam todos bem-vindos ao primeiro Simpósio Internacional de Saúde da Família e Comunidade da UFMS-CPTL. Hoje nós teremos a participação do palestrante José Nunes de Alencar Neto. Ele é cardiologista pelo Instituto Dante Pazanese de Cardiologia e pela Sociedade Brasileira de Cardiologia, Eletrofisiologia Invasiva e Implante de Dispositivos Cardíacos pela Universidade Federal de São Paulo, Unifesp, pelo Hospital de Santa Cruz, Lisboa, Portugal, e pela Sociedade Brasileira de Arritmologia Clínica, SOBRAC, com fellowship na Alemanha e em Barcelona. É médico em pronto-socorro do Instituto Dante Pazanese de Cardiologia, onde também atua como preceptor da residência médica em cardiologia. É autor de 3 livros técnicos, entre eles o Manual de Eletrocardiograma, da editora Sanar, e diversos artigos em revistas de alto impacto na área de eletrocardiografia e eletrofisiologia. Muitíssimo obrigada por ter aceitado o nosso convite e eu tenho certeza que será uma excelente palestra.
Muito obrigado. Então vamos começar. Eu vou falar em inglês, então, um pedido da organização do congresso. Então vamos lá. I am José Alencar. I will talk to you about evidence-based medicine, and I like to start my talks, my lectures, with this simple fact. Every apple that falls to the ground. This is how basic science works. Basic science includes basic physics, basic mathematics. So if you think that 2 plus 2 is always equal to 4, this is something that happens in 100% of the times that someone makes this account. 2 plus 2 is always 4. But this is not as simple as that in medicine. In medicine, the biological system includes several enzymes, several proteins that make that this account is not always 100%. Some medicine may work and may not work from patient to patient based on proteins and enzymes that we have not even yet discovered. So this is important to take into account. Based on that, I'd like to share the history of this guy over here. His name is Finn Wagstein. Finn Wagstein has prescribed in the decade of 60s beta blockers for 7 patients. Those patients were in the hospital because of acute pulmonary edema. And he decided to prescribe these beta blockers for this patient. They were with acute pulmonary edema because they had a disease called left ventricular failure, okay, heart failure in general. So this disease makes the heart beat weaker. And the beta blocker makes the heart even weaker. So when Finn Wagstein did this to 7 patients, the community science in that time thought that Finn Wagstein was crazy because it made no sense. Give to someone a medicine that is just the basics, the fundamentals, because he is bad. So he's going to be even worse later than that. Finn Wagstein had a thought in his mind, a theory. He decided to test in these patients. And his theory, years later, was true. But we'll see how did it happen. When Finn Wagstein thought of that, he knew that he had not scored the goal of the final of the World Cup. He had scored the first goal of the first game. In the first 10 minutes, he was with a bad team, and he was always playing against great teams. So he knew he had an entire championship ahead of him. So from the hypothesis to the confirmation of the hypothesis, Dr. Finn knew that he had to do much, much more to the idea to be confirmed in the future. So someone could ask for him, and in fact they had asked for him, did the patients stay alive because they were already going to stay alive? Imagine something, the mortality of heart failure is not 100% in 5 months. Is considerably lower than that. So he could have chosen patients that were really going to be alive at the end of 5 months. That was his follow-up. Did the patients, did they stay alive because the ICU of Dr. Finn is so good that the patients always be alive in that ICU, but not because of the beta blocker, but because of the intensive care that's so good? So this is another question. Third, is Sweden's water better for patients than Brazil's water, for example? This is not a good idea. This is a bad idea. But give a beta blocker to someone whose heart already beats weaker is also a bad idea. So bad idea versus bad idea, I gave one. Fourth, what's the chance that I will throw 6 coins up and it will always fall crown? This is important because if the mortality of heart failure was 50%, I could transform this system in a system like throw a coin to throw up a coin, you know? But it is not as simple as 50-50. It's even lower, you know? Even when I am playing a game, like throw a coin up, I have a chance, although it's slightly, it is not, I don't expect that to happen, you know, that it will fall 6 times in a row and 6 times crown, but there is a chance that for lucky, I will have crown 6 times, you know? In medicine, as this is not as simple as 50-50, the chance is even lower, you know, or even higher, depends on the chances. If a patient has a chance to survive of 10% in 5 months, for example, so there will be even a higher chance that this patient will be alive in Dr. Finn's study, understand? So give a medicine for 6 patients or 7 patients, and they all survived after 5 months. It is not a proof that this medicine works. Dr. Finn knew that he had to study more and more to have this confirmation. So from the hypothesis to confirmation, there is only one thing that could change this game, that is the presence of methods. With method, we can have a confirmation of an hypothesis. The method began to be described in medicine through this guy here. His name is Bradford Hill. He always said during his life that correlation is different from causality. What did he mean about it? He means that there are things in nature that are coincidences, but there are things in nature that I can prove that something generated other evidence. So, for example, this graphic over here that says that consumption of mozzarella cheese per capita correlates with civil engineering doctorates awarded in a country. There are some Bradford Hill criteria here. For example, the temporality. That is the only one criterion that is sine qua non. Without temporality, you cannot say that something generated other thing. You understand? With temporality, so you have an idea that makes some sense at least, and you can go on studying it. But without temporality, this idea makes no sense for Bradford Hill. Okay, temporality we see in the graphic, and we can see that there is temporality because when something goes up, the other thing goes up too. But there is no plausibility. It's not plausible that because of a country is consuming more mozzarella cheese, more doctorates for civil engineering are being awarded. This don't make sense. And there's no consistency either, because consistency is when many studies say the same thing. This is consistency. When you have consistency, you strengthen your hypothesis. So Bradford-Hill criteria are, there are more than this that I put on slide, but are basically temporality. As I said, this is a sine qua non criterion. Biological plausibility, it's when there is in nature something that makes you think that this could work. Biological plausibility is not a sine qua non criterion for a simple fact that sometimes I don't have plausibility for some evidence simply because I haven't discovered yet, but I will discover sometime. So plausibility is not sine qua non. Coherence. Coherence is when several other studies with other similar ideas point to the same evidence. For example, the anticoagulants work with atrial fibrillation. The anticoagulant, when I want to study the anticoagulants for venous thrombosis, I have coherence for the findings with atrial fibrillation. It's different. Atrial fibrillation is one thing, venous thrombosis is other thing. But because of anticoagulants work with atrial fibrillation, they could work also with venous thrombosis. So this is coherence. And experimental evidences, they are just one of the Bradford-Hill criteria. When you have, for example, studies in vitro, or studies on rats, or studies with the grade 1 of study. So these are experimental evidences. You cannot have experimental evidence alone or with plausibility, with temporality, and based on that, start prescribing some medicine for some disease. It's not how it works. You have Bradford-Hill criteria, and then you put it in a study, you put it in a randomized trial, an observational trial, and you make our hypothesis stronger, and then you can prescribe it. No, that happens with some of the studies that try to make the doctors prescribe hydroxychloroquine for COVID, because there are, in the beginning, there were just experimental evidences, and from this experimental evidence, there were people that were trying to make us prescribe hydroxychloroquine. It's not how it works. You go from Bradford-Hill criteria to the studies, and based on the studies, on the results of them, is that you prescribe something or not. So if you don't have Bradford-Hill criteria of temporality, it does not make sense. You doesn't even have to lose time studying it. But if there is temporality, so you go and search for biological plausibility. If there is, the hypothesis is even stronger. There is coherence is stronger. There is experimental evidence is even stronger, and it goes. Then, with the hypothesis generated and strong, you go to the studies. So some of the biases that happen in COVID pandemic period, that in some of the news that we heard and we saw on the newspapers of Brazil. So over 6,000 doctors consider hydroxychloroquine effective for COVID infection. This is plausible because if 6,000 doctors that are not silly are saying one thing, you have to consider what they're saying. So it's plausible, okay, but there is no consistency. What the 6,000 doctors are saying is not consistent with the results of the better studies, the best studies of COVID. And I don't know for this sentence, for this phrase, if there is temporality or not. The sentence does not generate one sense of temporality, so I cannot see temporality on it. The second, Brazilian president took hydroxychloroquine and was cured for COVID infection. He is a living scientific proof. Okay, there is temporality because he first took hydroxychloroquine and then he was a survivor of COVID. Okay, and there is plausibility because this is something being studied, okay? But it's not consistent, again, because the studies say otherwise. The studies say that hydroxychloroquine has no work for COVID. Okay, so this is a pyramid that shows the level of evidence from specialist opinion to the best evidence that are the randomized controlled trials. The specialist opinion is the worst evidence of all. Okay, then we have case reports, case series, and the two best evidence are observational studies and randomized controlled trials. In the next slides, I will show biases of specialist opinion, case reports, case series, and then I will say about, and then I will talk a little about how observational studies and randomized controlled trials, that are the two more important, of how they work. So, some biases of a specialist opinion. For example, if he says, after I put a stent on my patient, he never had any symptoms again. Okay, first of all, this is a small survey. You have one patient. Imagine that this disease, the myocardial infarction, will happen in 5 of 100 patients. So imagine that you have cards, okay, 100 cards, 95 cards of these are the same, and the other 5 are different. So the same, let's say it's a card of aces, okay? 95 cards of aces. The other 5 are not aces. So if you pull a card from that, you will have a 95% chance to have an aces card. That's obvious, okay? How do you know that your patient will not be one of those 95 that you pulled the card? 95 aces that were already going to be alive, already going to have no symptoms. You understand? So it's a small survey. The specialist view is very limited by that. Even if you have a big survey, it is not controlled. It's not randomized. I will talk about that later. Specialists have tendency to underestimate other therapies. That's obvious. Specialists think they are the better. Specialists don't think in the possibility of doing nothing. This is important. Specialists tend to make more and more for these patients, even though they don't need it. And there is the because God wanted bias. If something goes wrong, the specialist will always have an excuse for that. He says, "Oh, it was because I handed hydroxychloroquine for the patient in a more late stage of the disease. That's why it didn't work." So these are specialist opinion biases. He will always have some excuse to give it to you, and that's because he knew a lot about that disease. Case series biases. So after we started using ivermectin in Floriano, Piauí, that's a city in Brazil, the ICUs were closed for lack of demand. So first, this is not even published. You cannot say that if you didn't publish. There are confounding factors present. It's obvious. For example, the roads of the state of Piauí were closed during the pandemic peak in that state. So can you say it was ivermectin or the closing of the roads? You cannot say that. You have to study them and say definitely to me, was something or was the other thing? We don't know. Was it the natural cause of the disease? Do you know if all these patients when that phrase was said, all these patients were patients that were already going to be alive and not in ICUs? You cannot say that. And there's a selection biases. You understand? You give a medicine to someone that is a mild disease, he will have a better chance to be alive just because he has a mild disease. This is important too. Okay. And the biases in observational studies. For example, a Lancet study showed increased mortality in patients who used hydroxychloroquine. So chloroquine kills. This was a phrase on Twitter. It was trending topics, and it's not true. It is not true either. You cannot say that hydroxychloroquine kills. You can say that it's not effective, but not that it kills, because it is given for patients 60 years ago, and it did not kill. So it's not now that it kills. This study, like all observational studies, was heterogeneous. He had patients with a more mild disease in an arm of study, and more severe disease in another arm of study. It was exactly the arm of the study with a more severe disease where hydroxychloroquine was prescribed. So it was a selection bias, giving the drug to most serious patients because of compassion. The doctor felt compassion about the patient and prescribed it. And there are known and controllable confounding factors. Okay, all observational studies have it. And if they are controllable, we think it's going to be controllable. But the biggest issue in observational studies are the unknown confounding factors that I'll talk about in the next slide, where I show you how does an observational study works. So now we're going to talk about the two more important types, the kinds of studies. First, the observational study. The scientist comes from outcome, looks behind, and go to the drug. Okay, so he has the outcomes. 100 patients died from that disease. So I look behind and see what they took. They took hydroxychloroquine or not. Since he looks to the past, as he looks to the past, he has no power to select the patients that will take or not take hydroxychloroquine. He's looking to the past. So, as he cannot make this selection of patients, the non-confounders will always be present. For example, if I am studying a new drug for a pulmonary disease, I have to control the patients, this drug, for the same amount of patients with who smoke in one arm, in the arm that is taking the drug, and the same amount of patients who smoke in the arm that is not taking the drug. So the confounder will be controlled. That's what is control a confounder. As I look to the past, I cannot do this. Okay, so what I can do is make a logistic regression. That is, I will look at the past and see. For example, I had 500 patients, 500 smokers in the arm of the drug, and I had 300 smokers in the arm that did not take the drug. To control them, I will take out 200 of the arm that took the drug, and I will transform it in 300 versus 300. That's easy when I'm talking about one non-confounder. It's even harder, and it's getting harder and harder when we talk about lots of non-confounders: hypertension, COPD, diabetes, and many others. And there are, in observational studies, the unknown confounders. There are these confounders that were not yet discovered. For example, let's say there is an alteration in the gene KCNQ2 that it's going to be discovered in 2060. I don't know it yet, but it already exists. I don't know it yet. So this is an unknown confounder. In the unknown confounder, since it is unknown, the statistics cannot do anything for them. So they will always be present in my research. And that's because of the unknown confounders, that in an observational study, there is only a generated hypothesis. You cannot confirm hypothesis with an observational study. So the next time that you hear about a study in the newspaper or in a medical journal, you will see if it is an observational study or not. Because if it is, so you have to change the words in that study to it was generated an hypothesis that in the conclusion of the study. You understand? So that's how we read an observational study. It is only a generator of hypotheses. Now, the randomized controlled trial is the best kind of statistics that we have in medicine. Since I will take the patients to the arm of the treatment and the arm of the placebo, through a randomization. So the known and the unknown confounders will be controlled, because the alteration in that gene that I said to you, it will be controlled through a randomization. You understand? Since the known and the unknown confounders will be controlled, if there is statistical significance and clinical magnitude, so I can say that with a randomized control trial, I have a confirmed hypothesis. That's how we read randomized control trials. So observational studies generate hypotheses. That's what we have to know. And randomized control trials may confirm hypotheses if it is double-blinded. It is important to be double-blinded because the researcher and patient do not have to know what they are taking. If they know what they are taking, there is a subjectivity in some of the findings of the research that may act and may falsify the results of that research, okay? The patient and the researcher cannot know what they are doing to that patient because it should be blinded. It must have a sufficient and homogeneous sample. What does it mean? We calculate before research what is going to be the number of sample that I have, how many patients I have to have in one arm and in the other arm. This is a calculus, this is a test made before the study. I have to randomize that number of patients, and when the result is positive, then it was a sufficient sample. And it must be homogeneous. What do I mean about it? I mean that if there are 30% of hypertensive patients in the arm of the treatment, there must be 30% of hypertensive in the arm of placebo also, because they were randomized, okay? It must be 30 versus 30, 45 versus 45, and so goes on. And it must be a significantly statistical result. So if you have these three, you may be in front of a control randomized trial that confirm an hypothesis. So randomized control trials may confirm hypotheses when observational studies, they only generate hypotheses, okay? And a message for a COVID pandemic: every single randomized controlled trial with hydroxychloroquine failed to show the benefit of this drug versus COVID. So when someone says that there are 70% of the studies that confirm the benefit of hydroxychloroquine, he is hiding to you that the 30% that does not confirm, that denies it, these 30% are more important than the 70%. You understand? Because the 30% that deny are randomized controlled trials. Those ones that confirm hypothesis, and then confirmed that the hypothesis is denied. Hydroxychloroquine does not work on COVID based on randomized controlled trials. Okay, in the randomized controlled trials must have a clinically relevant result, and this will happen if there is indeed a benefit, clinical benefit to the patient. What do I mean about it? I mean that it's something as make with a study, okay? A study show that one exam was better. For example, the glycated hemoglobin. So with some new drug, I lowered the glycated hemoglobin. Okay, it's one exam, but to be clinically relevant, I have to prove that this drug, aside from lowering the glycated hemoglobin, he also has some benefit to the patient. Okay, it will ameliorate his lifestyle. It will make him more functional. It will lower his mortality. So these are clinically relevant results. That clinically relevant result must be good and must overcome the risks. It's no good when a drug has a clinically good and relevant benefit, but at the same time, he has more risks than benefits. That does not work. This is a drug that I will not give to patients. And if the absolute magnitude of the effect justifies its use, and that's the idea of the NNT, the number needed to treat. What do I mean about it? It's no use of a drug that I will have to give to 500 patients to avoid one event. Understand? It's a number, a high number. This will signify costs to the public health system, and this is not good. I must have a drug that has an absolute magnitude that justifies its use, according also to its cost to the health system. Okay, and from the hypothesis to confirmation, remembering now what Dr. Finn Bergstein did, he was studying a drug in a scenario that would make the heart beat even weaker. Remember, it was the beta blocker. He knew that he had to have methods. So the method came. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Okay, so this is the golden standard of evidence-based medicine, and avoid selection bias because it was controlled. It had 80% power. Is the power to avoid false negatives. It is in medicine we always use 80 or 90% power. 80 is usually accepted, okay? And had a P of 5%. P is the maximum number of false positives that my research will encounter, okay? In 95% of the times, it will have true positive results, okay? And it was positive in this study. This study is called Copernicus trial. It was positive. It had an NNT of 18 to just one death. In the time of use, it was 2 years, if my memory doesn't fail, okay? 1 in 18 patients that take this medicine, carvedilol, they will have one death avoided because of that, because of carvedilol only. It is incredible. It's a clinical benefit of reduced mortality. You save lives with this drug. So from the hypothesis of Dr. Finn, that was a bad hypothesis, we have the confirmation only when this study was made, and it showed a clinical benefit, a very good clinical benefit. And since then, we use this drug in the treatment of heart failure and avoiding deaths, because this medicine can do it. That's how evidence work. Okay, so the take-home messages are: medicine is a science of uncertainty. Okay, we have to be adapted to this in a modern course of medicine, because we have to understand that we give a drug to 100, 200 people to have one endpoint, one outcome avoided. That's how medicine works. Medicine does not work as simple as, oh, I took hydroxychloroquine and cured myself. That's not how it works. It's obvious, okay? To accept one evidence, it needs to be read and not just passed on a chain, on WhatsApp, for example. It must be at least plausible, and it must have temporality. When you have these two Bradford-Hill criteria, you go to the studies. And in the studies, you have to have a sufficient sample, and you have to have statistical significance. And you have to have a relevant clinical benefit. Only after all the steps, you have a new drug in medicine, and you can prescribe it in an ethical way to patients with some disease. Okay? That was everything I had to say. I thank you for the opportunity, and that's it.